Welcome back. This segment is on the switch structure. Switch is a selection structure, not a repetition structure. And I've left it until later in these segments because it's not very commonly used. It is part of the language, and modern languages almost all have some sort of a switch or case-based control structure to do a very specific kind of selection. So this will be a relatively short segment, but you do have to get comfortable with this kind of a selection-based construct. So a switch statement is a selection construct. There's no looping or repetition involved with a switch. And it's a very specific kind of a construct. We'll look at the general form first. So we're going to say that we switch on an expression or a variable, and whatever that evaluates to, we will then jump someplace. So if it evaluates to the equivalent of one of the cases, we'll jump to that case and execute the statements under that case. So we have 4 keywords here: switch, case, break, and default. Each case statement must be a constant, and they must be unique. So we're going to evaluate the expression or variable and decide where to jump to. So here on this slide we have an example. It's best to jump to a real-world looking example of how to write a switch statement in C. And in this example we're asking the user to enter the choice of something. I don't know what it's the choice of, but we've apparently presented them with some choices and said pick one of them, and then we switch on their choice. We have 2 cases in here, case 0 and case 1. If choice has 0 in it, we will jump to case 0 and start executing lines of code. When we hit a break statement, then the switch is over. We fall out the bottom. If choice had a 1 in it, we would jump to case 1 and start executing lines of code. And if choice didn't have 0 or 1, we would jump to the default case and execute whatever is after the default label. So this is a very small switch. There's only 2 cases and the default case. Typically, you would have many more cases than this. If you had only 2, you would probably write an if-else statement. So if choice is equal to 0, then do this, else. If choice is equal to 1, do this, else. Do whatever else you would want to in a default scenario in an if statement. So if we had several cases, maybe 5 or more, we might choose to use a switch to jump to specific lines of code to execute. Notice that there's a break statement in each of the cases, case 0, case 1, and default. If you forget the break statement, the flow of control will continue into the next case, and this is called bleeding into the next case or from one case to another. Sometimes you would want to do that, so the break statement is required to prevent it. Let's take this code into the development environment now and actually see it execute and walk through it in the debugger and play around with it. It's the easiest way to see how the switch statement actually works. I've created a new project called Switch Demo, and I've added a source file called switchdemo.c. So let's start from scratch. We'll make a variable for the user's choice, and then we'll ask them to enter a choice. Give them some options, maybe 0, 1, 2, 3. I don't know what those mean. My typing seems to be a little bit rusty here. And then scan in that value, scanf, into the variable choice. And now let's output what they chose just to have a sense of security. You entered and I'm going to put a carriage return at the beginning of that. And it doesn't cost very much to run this, so let's see if we've made any mistakes so far. F7 and F5. And enter a choice. Let's put 3. You entered 3. Press any key to continue. So we seem to have successfully asked the user for an integer. Now we're going to switch on that variable. So here's the switch statement that we're learning that's new. And inside of the braces, we can put our case statements. The indentation of the case statements is a little bit inconsistent, and you can put your case statements in here if you want to, or you can put them back here if you want to. So we're going to have case 0 and case 1. And let's leave out the default case for now to show that the default case isn't really necessary to have a working switch statement. You entered choice 0. Some carriage returns would help. And the break statement. You entered a choice of 1. I'm just making stuff up for the purpose of seeing the flow of control in the switch statement. So let's compile this. No mistakes so far. I'm going to put a breakpoint on the switch. So let's now run this with F5. Enter a choice. I'm going to enter 1. You entered 1, so we do have the right value in that variable. And we've hit the breakpoint. We can see that our choice is 1. So switch on 1, and the next line of code should be, we'll jump to the case that matches that, case 1, and start executing from there. And that was lucky. It went to the right line of code. It wasn't lucky at all. We did the right thing. We output printf, you entered a choice of 1, and we'll make sure that that's what it did. Some more carriage returns would have been useful. Let's put a carriage return there, a carriage return there. Now I'm going to recompile those changes, and let's run it again with a choice of 0. So F5, enter a choice 0, and we see that we jump to case 0, and then when we hit the break statement, the switch statement is over. Okay, a very, very common error in C programming is when you forget the break statement in a case. So let's suppose that we forgot that break statement. I'll just comment it out and recompile. Now when we enter a choice of 0 and we hit that breakpoint, what you'll see is we execute case 0, whatever lines of code you have there, and then we bleed into the next case. We execute case 1 as well. And this is a very common bug, forgetting the break statement in a particular case, and in some software shops if you ever have a case that does not need a break statement, you're encouraged to put a comment in there saying that there is no break statement for this case, just to let people know that you haven't made that mistake. So in the output we see you entered a choice of 0, you entered a choice of 1, which probably isn't what the programmer had intended. Okay, in this, what if someone entered something other than 0 or 1? Nothing would happen, the switch would just be over, it would fall out the bottom. If we had a default case, and someone entered other than the cases that are available, we could say you did not enter 0 or 1. Put in some carriage returns here so we can see what's going on the output. And it's considered good practice to put a break statement even in your default case, even though it doesn't really do anything. It's put there to try to avoid someone else coming along and adding a case, and we have that forgotten break statement problem. So let's run this now and enter something other than 0 or 1. Let's enter, okay, 3. You entered 3. Now we'll have hit the breakpoint, and we're going to switch on the value 3, and it recognizes that there is no case 3, so it jumps to the default case and will execute that. The default case is very commonly used for an error situation. So you have all of the expected cases, and then if for some reason this evaluates to what isn't one of the expected cases, then this is probably an error case of some kind. We're going to implement a specification that uses the switch statement in one or two more segments from here. I'm not sure I can remember exactly where, but you will see a switch statement put into practice where the user picks something off of a menu and then we jump to an appropriate case based on what they've entered. While we're in here, let me just point out a couple of other rules about the switch statement. This must be an integer, or it must evaluate to an integer. And the cases must also be integer, and they must be constant and unique. So we can't put a variable here, and we can't have two case 1s. I wonder what would happen if we did have two case 1s. Let's compile that. And it says 1 failed. Here's the error message. Case value 1 already used. So that's an example of a very good error message coming out of this compiler. Sometimes they're not nearly as helpful as that. So we have to have unique cases, and they have to be constant, and they have to be integers. They can be anything that you want. We could have case 10,000 and case 1. Whatever you need to jump to an appropriate place based on the value of a variable or an expression. Okay, here's the review of the concept that we've covered in this segment. The switch construct is used to selectively execute some statements based on the value of a variable or an expression. And we would say we switch on this variable or we switch on this expression. Don't forget that the break statement in each case is to prevent bleeding into the next case. If we want to only execute statements based on one case, then we don't want to continue execution into the next one. The default case in the switch is optional. If you want to have usually an error condition where you didn't find any of the expected values, then you would execute a default case. Sometimes you don't want or need a default case at all, and the switch allows you to just leave that out. The values in the case statements must be integers, and they must be constants, and they must be unique. It won't compile if you don't meet all of those categories. And that leads to why the switch has very limited use. You can't use ranges of values where you'd like to execute some lines of code based on a range of possible values. You can't use double values or floating point values of any kind. And it's just a very nice selection construct to use when you have a very specific set of circumstances, and it is effective and not too common. I'll see you in the next segment.